Hello and welcome to today's webcast, Upgrading to Azure SQL, Ask the Experts Session 4, brought to you by our Microsoft Insight commercial team. I'm Claire Folger, your CSP Marketing Coordinator at Insight, and I will be your moderator today. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. This webcast is designed to be interactive between you and the presenters. The webcast console you are looking at can be completely customized. You can resize or move any of the windows that you have open. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. All questions from this webcast will be captured, and there will be a Q&A during the last few minutes of the presentation. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the question mark icon below the presentation window. The help guide covers common technical issues. I would now like to turn the presentation over to our presenters today, Jason Wilson and Jessica Fong. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claire. Hi, everyone. This is Jason Wilson. I'm an Azure architect here at Insight. I'm part of our Microsoft Solution Consultants team. My role here at Insight is to help provide guidance around solutions and architecture within Azure and within the Microsoft product stack. Co-presenting with me today is Jessica Fong. Jessica?
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. Hi, everyone. As Jason said, this is Jessica Fong. I'm the Cloud Success Manager here at Insight. If you haven't worked as a Cloud Success Manager before, really my goal is just to ensure that our clients make the most out of their cloud investments. So from the moment they join our Insight's Cloud Solution Program, I work with them to implement best practices in their Azure environment and act as a main point of contact moving forward should they have any questions about their Azure environment. We, of course, have a deep bench of technical expertise here at Insight, and so I act as sort of the liaison between our clients and our internal teams here at Insight. So for today's webinar here, a couple of things that we're going to cover. For those of you who haven't had a chance to attend any of our other Ask the Expert sessions, I'll do a quick overview of what we've covered so far. Today, we'll also be talking about topics like cloud governance, get into some cost management best practices, topics like Azure Hybrid Benefit, Azure reservations, and then sort of wrap up with a discussion around governance, security, and policy best practices. So like I said, if you're interested in checking out some of the other Ask the Expert sessions, in our first session, we did cover software economics, so optimizing your Microsoft licensing and contracts. In the second session, we had some of our folks from our cloud economics team come and talk about what it looks like to actually move to the cloud and assessing your workloads. And then in our third session, the one right before this one, we had a couple of our cloud architects actually come on and talk about the benefits of migrating to Azure SQL and then what that migration would look like. So if you're interested in viewing any of those sessions, feel free to grab those links and we'll send them out after the call, I'm sure, so that you can get a chance to go check them out as well. And then I will pass it over to Jason to talk about a little bit about cloud governance here. Jason, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jessica. So I want to kind of dive into what the principles of cloud governance really mean. One of the things that often happens with regard to any type of technology adoption is that people focus on the technology. And obviously it's a lot more than that. Change is about adapting not only the technology, but how you do business. There's a concept called the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure, which means you aren't just changing the technology you're using. You're actually looking at how your enterprise functions, how your culture functions behind it, and how you work. So oftentimes we talk about the people, the process, and the technology at these abstract layers, but in truth, these are real people doing real things, following real processes, using real tools, and so making sure that we have a clear understanding of change management, that we understand that having this control and stability versus speed and results is balanced, right? We want to make sure our adoption methodologies make sense. And having a plan in terms of how you get there is critically important. That's something Insight has a lot of experience around, and we're able to help folks make that transition. So one of the things that that people often ask about is why do I need cloud governance, right? I just said a bunch of great things about change management and adoption and people and process, but what does that really have to do with cloud governance particularly? And what that really is that there's a lot of questions around what that transformation activity actually looks like. It's going to change tools and resources that people use. And so governance becomes that balance point between that transformation and the risks that you're taking. And you have to view everything in an incremental lens and not as okay, now we're in the cloud. Okay, well, that's okay. We are going to move to the cloud, but we're not going to do it in such a way that's going to be disruptive to our business. So some of the questions that I get asked a lot are, how am I going to get this workload moving, and how am I going to get things up and running without disrupting my existing business? How do I understand who's going to do what, right? And so this is where the cloud adoption framework, right, or the cloud governance model really can help you understand who is going to do what processes are going to be used, and what tools are useful in those particular scenarios. So as you can see, there's these disciplines around cloud governance, and some of these pieces, flow across all of them, right? So like blueprints, for example, there's this concept around, what makes sense in terms of an architectural perspective to move, or policy. So these are things that affect the entire structure of cloud governance. And then you have individual categories like cloud management, security baseline that are hugely important, but you have to dive deep on each one of those. And so to kind of lend into that, what we're going to do right now is we're going to go ahead and jump into cost management. And Jessica is going to kind of walk you through some of the principles around that to give you an idea of this is the high level of detail you want to go into when you're actually evaluating and looking at how am I going to govern my environment. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jessica.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. I really love that you hit on the fact that, cloud governance is striking that balance between business transformation, so your people, processes, and technology, and then balancing that risk. I think in theory, it sounds easy, but it's definitely not. And I think that's the same when it comes to Azure cost management as well. It's spend management specifically is a really critical piece of having that well-governed cloud. I have it up on the slide because I talk with clients all of the time, and one of the hottest topics is how do we get our arms around what we're actually putting into the cloud? And it's not just it's not just managing your costs, it's a combination of working with the right people in your organization and teams. And so when you think of cost management, I like to think of it in sort of three buckets. And so you can see them up on the screen here, but looking at, okay, how do we optimize what we've put into the cloud? Who are we providing visibility to in our organization? Because that's going to be really critical in terms of being able then to actually manage it. And then accountability. How do we hold our people and our teams accountable for following sort of these practices that we've put into place so that we can actually manage the cloud? I think moving to Azure provides a lot of businesses really great opportunities to improve, their workloads, how they do business. But at the end of the day, there is a lot of risk involved when you move to a different type of model like this. And so one of the things that we try to do with our clients at Insight is really ensure that they're comfortable with sort of these concepts and then being able to implement them in their own businesses. So if we dive into sort of our first topic here, which is optimization in the cloud, Jason had that slide up that had a list of a lot of really great built-in tools in Azure that you can leverage. One of the best tools, I think, when it comes to optimization that you can use is Azure Advisor. So Azure Advisor basically provides you recommendations, cost recommendations, security recommendations, other recommendations around reliability and performance, based on what you have deployed in your environment. And so this is a really great place to go and look to see, hey, you're running virtual machines 24/7, and Microsoft is going to make a recommendation for you to look at potentially purchasing an Azure reservation to save money. Or maybe you don't have MFA enabled for some of your users, and so it will recommend from a security perspective, take a look at that and enable it. And one of the things that I've seen, a lot of clients, this is really underutilized. They don't have somebody that's dedicated to checking the advisor regularly to make sure that they're, doing what they can to really optimize their environment here. The other thing that you'll see in Azure as well that I think helps a lot of clients save money is Azure reservations. So these reservations, if you're not familiar, essentially what you can do is purchase or commit to purchasing 1 to 3 years of a certain service at a discounted rate. Microsoft used to make clients purchase these reservations up front, but now you can actually spread those costs out monthly. So from a cash flow perspective, it makes a lot of sense. And when it comes to certain services that you're using in the cloud, you really do have an opportunity to save quite a bit of money. I would say virtual machines are the ones that I see clients regularly take advantage of, but there's also reservations for storage, for Azure SQL, Databricks. So depending on what you're using in the cloud, I always recommend taking a look at what reservations you can purchase as well. And then, of course, too, if you have existing licensing for Windows Server or SQL Server, if you have active software assurance with those licenses, those can be used in the cloud as well. And so, I would really highly recommend taking a look at what licenses you own today, and if you are in the cloud or if you're looking at moving to Azure, how you can use those. There's a really great calculator out on Microsoft's website that helps you apply those licenses to see what types of machines you can be running. But this is also something that Insight can help you with. And so, if you're interested, please feel free to reach out to your client executive to get in touch with some of our licensing specialists or our Microsoft specialists so that we can help you make the most out of your cloud experience here. And I think some of the other interesting sort of optimization services that you can use are going to be, let's see, I think my slides are jumping around here. Okay. Some of the optimization features that you can use are Azure Automation. So Azure Automation is actually both an automation and configuration service. And it really helps you manage your environment and be consistent about it. So Microsoft breaks down automation into a couple of different buckets, but at the end of the day, when and where possible, you want to automate those tasks that you're doing frequently, that are time-consuming and error-prone. And so leveraging Azure Automation for things like shutting down your resources when you don't need them is going to be really beneficial. You can use auto-scaling. Like on the flip side of that, you can use auto-scaling to actually scale resources should you need them. But essentially, it helps you make sure that you don't have to constantly be doing something hands-on keyboard all the time when it's a task that needs to be done very regularly. You can build runbooks to automate common tasks too, as well as you can see up here, use Azure Automation to manage some of those desired state configurations that you may have in your environment. And Azure Automation even allows you to do things like if you're running Windows or Linux systems, you can use their update management feature and schedule the deployments of some of those updates that you need to apply. And likewise, also for the machines that maybe don't need an update, exclude them from those deployments. So you can start to get really granular with those, with leveraging Azure Automation.
Hey, and Jessica, just to add a little point to that, what we're talking about here is, and people often view this from the perspective of Azure resources, and the last question's like, well, what about my non-Azure resources? And there's tooling on top of that you can layer on top of this, things like Azure Arc, for example, where you can actually take resources from other cloud providers or even your on-prem resources, pull them into Azure from a view perspective and manage them natively, just like you would an Azure resource. So there's other layers on top of this that can really be helpful.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Jason. And hey, time is money, right? So, if you can do things to sort of simplify your management across multiple environments, it's always something that we encourage you to do. Awesome. And then sort of the last piece that I'll touch on in terms of optimizing your environment, there's something called Azure Spot Instances. And I'm going to say this up front, that this is not the solution for everybody. So you really want to evaluate what type of workloads that you have that you would use an Azure Spot instance for. But essentially, Microsoft is now letting customers use the unused compute capacity in their data centers at a significantly reduced cost. In some cases, you can save up to 90% compared to those pay-as-you-go rates. But basically, what you'll do is that you run maybe a test workload or a batch job, and then as soon as Microsoft needs that compute back, they may evict your workload is the terminology that they use. But they essentially take the capacity back, and then when there's additional capacity available for you to use, then you'd be able to run that workload again. So again, not perfect for every workload that you're trying to run. And if you need dedicated compute capacity, of course, you want to look at some of the other Azure services. But, for those batch jobs and things that really are fine being interrupted, Azure Spot Instances is a great service to look at using. Alrighty. And then sort of that second bucket that I wanted to talk about was the visibility. So who in your organization has visibility to what you're spending in the cloud. This is really important. Again, you want to make sure that somebody is responsible for regularly checking what are your costs in the cloud. What is your environment looking like? Are you regularly checking those Azure Advisor recommendations, security recommendations, things like that? Microsoft has quite a bit of built-in reporting using their cost analysis tool, and you can sort of slice and dice your views to really get a sense of where you're spending money. And then if you do have spikes in consumption, how do you drill in and manage that to see, okay, did we just spin up a new Azure SQL machine? Are we using machine learning? And all of a sudden this costs us a lot of money. You want to be able to dive into that. And so making sure that you've got good visibility into your environment is really important. And I work with clients all the time to help them sort of get a grasp on the reporting. You can export these reports and also use them in Power BI dashboards if you're Power BI dashboard savvy and want to build out sort of your own customized reports there. Awesome. And then I want to dive into sort of the accountability, which I've been touching on as we go. But from a tactical perspective, how do we hold people accountable for actually following our budgets? How do we make sure that we're getting good visibility into what's being deployed in our environment and things like that? And so the first thing is, in Azure, I highly recommend setting a budget. This is one of the easiest things you can do to hold your organization accountable to your overall spend in the cloud. Budgets can actually be scoped at both the subscription level, as well as you can even get very granular and scope subscriptions at a resource group level and even a resource level. And when you set a budget, you essentially also dictate then who gets notified when you hit 80% of your budget or whatever threshold that you want to set for your organization. But this ensures that you're constantly keeping track of how much you're spending in the cloud. I would say, unfortunately, we've had clients who've gotten surprise bills at the end of the month, and after that, they're like, "Yep, we're setting a budget now," and to make sure that someone in our organization knows if we do start to get to that budget threshold. Just something really easy that you can go and do, and it only takes a few minutes. The next piece to this for holding your organization accountable is leveraging tags. So we had a principal architect at Insight one time say to a client, "Tagging your cloud resources is as important as naming your children." I love that. I think it's pretty funny, but also highlights, how valuable tagging your resources in your environment can be. Tags are another way that you can actually filter and slice your data. So those cost analysis reporting screenshots that I showed you on the last slide, you can actually use tags and then look at, okay, if I've tagged a resource for a certain project, I can actually now see all of the resources with that same tag and how much is that project or that workload in Azure costing me. And so it's another way to help manage your environment. And then lastly here, from an accountability perspective, policies. So policies are a really great way to not only, one, audit the compliance of your resources, but also enforce the compliance. So when you think about a policy, you could actually enable a policy that says, don't let anyone deploy an Azure virtual machine without tagging, it with an environment tag. So is it for production or is it for dev test? And that's a really great way then that you ensure that people in your organization know that they're following, whatever guidelines and parameters you set for managing your cloud. So I'll pause there too. Jason, do you have anything to add that maybe I might have missed or skipped over, talked through too quickly about kind of holding your organization accountable?
Yeah, this is, what you covered is fantastic. So it's really more about, again, having that plan and following through with it. I know oftentimes, especially when it comes to tagging and policy, these are things that, slow things down. But I always say, go slow to go fast. By taking that time up front and having that governance policy, it will allow you to accelerate significantly downstream.
Yeah, awesome. Great points there. Well, Jason, I will pass it over to you to sort of share with everyone our best practices and things that we recommend to our clients.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have my own thought process around this. People are always really excited about telling you what to do, but it's much harder to get people to tell you what not to do. And it really is critical that you have this in mind as you're moving through. So Jessica talked about, setting budgets and how critical that is. But you also have things called patterns and anti-patterns, right? What are things that are commonly done? What are things that you should never do? And this can really define the success that you have inside of whatever your cloud adoption strategy looks like. This is that whole measure twice, cut once philosophy. Don't just adopt your plan and then push forward and only look at the plan. You always want to be reassessing what is going on, and you can find these definitions of what the policy samples and these type of governance models look like. The other big piece is about securing user access, right? So as part of your strategy, you want to be following the best practices, and this comes into that security portion. So we talked about the different cloud governance pieces. Cloud governance around security is huge. I work with clients all the time where the same identity that is being used as a global admin has an email account that is also being used as the owner of their Azure subscriptions. And one of the first conversation pieces I have is don't do that, right? You want to use elevated accounts. You want to have your global admin accounts or your owner accounts be accounts that don't have email access, because you're reducing your security threat vectors and thresholds. And all of these kind of things, those are just high-level best practices, but these are the kind of simple, easy to do out-of-the-box tasks that you can do to really move yourself forward. Obviously, things like MFA and conditional access can be huge in terms of protecting your environment. So, when you start really building out your governance plans, you want to include all of those elements and look at it from an adoption perspective, because I was just at a security conference recently, and the number of people who raised their hand when they said, hey, has IT recently made it harder for you to get access to resources? And about half the room raised their hand, which is great. It would have been better if the 100% of the room had raised their hand, because accessing resources should be difficult when it comes to governing those resources. Using the resources should be easy, but accessing them to manage should have steps involved in order to be able to ensure security is kept in place. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the next steps. So Jessica, do you want to jump in here real quick, and then we'll add some flavor?
Yeah, sounds good. So in terms of kind of next steps and what does this all mean for you, I think, Jason and I tried to give you some really actionable items that you could take away. If you are in Azure today, If you don't have a budget set, go do it. But, asking yourself, who's your partner and what do they do for you? Here at Insight, we really want to make sure that our clients are successful when it comes to, diving into the cloud. And so whether you're just getting started there or have been in Azure for a really long time, it might be cliche to say that we can do it all, but we really can help clients no matter what part of the cloud journey they're on. And I think there's always an opportunity to help our clients optimize, save money in the cloud, and then look at, okay, what's next and what's going to be best for their business. And so asking yourself things like, what is your strategy and what is your plan when you move to Azure? I love this, and I think Jason can probably expand on it a little bit more, but how do you test that plan and how do you review that strategy? Who are you doing that with in your organization, and really ensuring that you're creating an Azure or a cloud environment, hopefully in Azure, maybe in another cloud. It's really up to your business, but making sure that there's longevity there and that you're not going to venture into the wild, wild west of the cloud and then realize this isn't for our business because you didn't have a good strategy in place to start. We really want to set you up for success from the beginning. And then, of course, I think the last question here is great too, of, do you have that process or framework to really manage your cloud spend and make sure you've got a good handle on your cloud?
Yeah, I definitely want to add a little color to the, what is your test plan and how do you actually test your plan? Governance is just like any other, piece in your environment. You wouldn't create backups without ever testing whether those backups actually can be recovered, right? And so the same is true with a governance strategy. You want to make sure that if your governance model is built in such a way that it's allowing you to create resources, you also want to make sure you understand when it's not allowing the creation of resources. When is it failing you? And walking through those processes and having people engage. And that really comes down to having, people be in charge and responsible for that governance policy, not just writing it out and following it like it's a blueprint, right? You want to follow it like it's a blueprint as if you're an architect. And that's really a key part of the whole strategy. So if you are interested in learning more about cloud adoption, obviously you want to reach out to your Insight client executive. And we have one more really cool slide, and this is going to be, and Joe or Dan, I'm not sure which one of you wanted to speak to this, but we definitely wanted to give you one last piece here.
Hey, sorry about that. I couldn't hear you guys for a second there. My screen went blank, so I just rebooted. But thanks a lot for all this information, and a couple of things that I took away is really having a plan as well as what part of the journey is a client in. And that's really where we can help at the SQL and Windows Server Concierge. We can really help you from very basic things of getting simple questions answered to understanding, better understanding needs and priorities, so we can help you create an itinerary to facilitate that plan. Really, everything from providing experts to explore the possibilities in our envisioning sessions, to helping with access to both economic and technology assessments, to better understand what your assets are and how to use what you have more effectively versus even looking to purchase something additional, as well as health checks to maximize performance, as well as provide programs like workshops that can increase time to value and adoption with tools, skill sets, and training. And all this, we can also source out possible funding for programs and the different resources like mentioned. The ultimate goal really is to help you modernize your application and your data investment. So anything that we can do to help in that area, you're welcome to contact us through that distribution email there, and we can source great resources like Jessica and Jason to help support you.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. So at this point, we are at the questions. phase. There was a question that was asked, and I thought I sent it out, but if it didn't, I want to make sure I do. The question was, what will happen if there's an issue while updating the VM? So let's talk a little bit about resiliency in Azure. So first of all, when you talk about VMs in particular, inside of a data center, there's always going to be 3 copies of that virtual machine, right? And so it would really depend on what the issue is. Like if you're pushing an update and it fails, then the update itself is going to fail, right? So really, it's about building a plan about remediation. Do you have backups? Are you replicating? What kind of workload is it? Is it a file server? Is it an application server? So there's a lot of variability in what will happen. And this is where good design can really help you. So for example, if you're building this out into a cluster and you're doing an application update and you go to run the update on one of the elements in the cluster, now you can watch for that failure and have remediation built into your governance policy. So there's a lot of ways that I could potentially answer that. The biggest thing I would say is I'm going to flip that as, what is your plan for when there's an issue when updating VMs, right? So that's what the nature of governance is to have a plan for things as they occur. How do we handle? How do we respond? How do we remediate?
Hey, Jason, I've got another question here, and maybe you can expand on it. It kind of expands a little bit about what you're talking about. Can you talk about how automation can help with governance?
Yeah, absolutely. So automation, it should be the end result of a well thought out governance plan. And what that really means is that when we get to the point where we know what our expected responses are, we can automate it. And we can do that using all kinds of tools, whether it's logic apps, whether it's just using standard runbook automation. And you can do that across different product sets. Like we're talking a little bit about infrastructure here, but there's also security automation. So when you start talking about what automation is and how it can help, at the end of the day, automation is putting your governance plan into motion using tools.
Fantastic.
Any other questions? There was a question about sending the URLs and things like that. That will all be provided post presentation. So thank you for that question.
Can you give a very high level on? You mentioned a product called Arc.
Yeah, so Azure Arc is a service that allows you to take other operating systems and present them as a layer into Azure to be managed. It can do it with other services like SQL database and Postgres databases. But at the end of the day, what it is, it's a presentation layer into Azure that allows you to manage those resources natively. So when you think about the flexibility and power that gives you, if I have multi-cloud environments and I have infrastructure on-premise and I'm running Azure, today from an administrative overhead perspective, I have to have resources that can do all of those things and manage all of those things. And I'm probably using multiple disparate tool sets to do so. With Azure Arc, I can enable those workloads to be seen as native Azure workloads and manage them centrally through Azure. So it helps in terms of limiting the skill set required to manage all of those different pieces. It's a pretty fantastic resource, and I definitely recommend just checking out Azure Arc. ARC is how it's spelled.
So not only is it a technology, but it eliminates you having to look for those unicorns, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Looking for somebody who knows how to manage resources in AWS and GCP and Azure, and they also know the 15 different tools you need for on-prem, and they've been using System Center since 2008, right? So, so yeah, it can be very difficult to find resources who can do that across the board. So,
yeah, especially affordable ones, right?
So the question came in and said, can you give me a real life example? I'm going to assume that you mean a real life example of using Azure Arc. One example maybe I'm monitoring systems, just performance, right? Nothing that I wouldn't do in any other admin environment. When I'm on-prem, I have my monitoring tools unless I'm using System Center, for example. And then in Azure, I'm using Azure Monitor. And then in AWS, I'm using yet another tool. Well, rather than doing that, I can take the agent for Azure Arc, put it on all those servers, and all those servers get presented as a layer into Azure Monitor. So now I'm just using Azure Monitor to monitor all those same resources, and I'm not having to use multiple tools to do so.
So it's kind of like a front-end UI as well as the ability to manage all of those different translations.
Yeah, exactly. And again, you also get the ability to, it's not just manage, but now you can also automate, things like that. Yep, awesome. Were there any other questions? Okay. So I want to thank everyone for attending. If there's anyone else on the team who'd like to add any last notes, I really appreciate everyone's time. And if you have any questions, again, reach out to your Insight Client Executive, and just know that we have everything you would need, not just from a products perspective, but also from a services perspective around helping you build out your environment, get that governance right from the start, and help you incrementally build that trust and success in the cloud.
And I'll just echo that and say thank you, everyone, for attending. Thanks to the team for getting this set up. Jason, it's always a pleasure hearing you talk about the cloud and our technology here. So yeah, thanks, everyone, for your time.
There is something here about a plugin. Not really sure what the question is, though. Okay.